Constraints are challenging, but they also force us to push the limits of our skills and ingenuity. So when I was tasked with building a waterfall coffee table without the right material for a truly continuous grain, I welcomed the opportunity to get creative. Let's see how it went.
Come on.
This isn't my first time building for a client, nor is it my first time making a coffee table. It is, however, the first time that a client has asked me to build something using their own material. So my client's name is Ben, and apparently his friend is an arborist who gave him 2 slabs of black walnut. I went over to his house to check out the boards and was happy to discover that they were inside a garage, stickered, and reading around 7%. Then he showed me their ottoman, which was 42 inches long by 42 inches wide, and asked if it would be possible to build a coffee table that would cover half of it, but could be slid to either the front or the back depending on if it was in use or not. This could work with a few caveats. First, to cover half of the ottoman, the table would need to be 2 feet wide, which means we'd have to either joint the 2 boards together and put metal legs on either side, since there wouldn't be enough walnut left to use for the legs. Alternatively, we could use one of the boards for the top and the other for the legs, and match up the grain and sapwood lines as much as possible to create a faux continuous grain. The boards were from the same tree and similar enough, I thought, that I could get a pretty good match. If we went this direction though, that would mean using epoxy to get the rest of that 2-foot width. Ben liked the latter option, as it would preserve the live edge where the wood meets the epoxy. I also thought this was the better route, so we ironed out a few more details and I got to work. The first step was to get the legs roughly cut to length and then rip one straight edge. I made this cut just outside the sapwood line to preserve as much material as possible. Even after ripping these down though, they were still too wide for my 12-inch joiner, so I used a planer sled to get the first flat face on each board, and then ran everything through the planer to get the second face flat and parallel. Now that the mill marks were removed, I could really hone in on getting the grain to match where the legs would meet the top. The most important part was to get the transition between the heartwood and sapwood just right, as this is the most visually striking feature. I could tell these were air dried as they had those purple and gray hues that you just don't get with kiln dried walnut, so I also did my best to match up those colors. Once I had each end paired with a leg, I clamped the adjoining boards next to one another, with the heartwood sapwood border perfectly lined up. Then I used the track saw to rip the outside edge of both boards in a single cut. I then repeated this process for the other end of the top and its corresponding leg. Since the outer edge of the sapwood was variable in width, I needed to create a smooth transition between the 2 live edges. To do this, I again clamped the adjacent pieces together and used an angle grinder with a cut saw disc to shape the live edges at this transition. I took only the minimum amount of material that was needed to achieve the desired effect. Then I cleaned up the rough scratches with an orbital sander and 100 grit paper and repeated the process for the other transition. Before moving on to the epoxy work, I spent a bit of time cleaning up any loose material from the knots, as these would get filled in at the same time as the main pour. I decided to make a single mold that was 4 feet wide, with the tabletop on one side and the legs on the other. This way, I could cut the epoxy down the middle and end up with 2 foot wide legs and a 2 foot wide top. A few tips on mold making that I've gathered over the years. First, attach the sides to the top of the mold base, rather than along the edge of the base. That means making the base 3/4 of an inch wider in all directions to account for the thickness of the sides. It is definitely more of a pain in the ass to crawl underneath the mold and drive your nails or screws up from the bottom, but it really makes a big difference to not have a vertical seam for your epoxy to be pulled into. Second, always put caulk between the 2 pieces you're joining, as well as on both the inside and the outside seams. And always reinforce your seams with nails, screws, or something similar. The melamine likes to slide around on the caulk, so use some clamps to secure it in place before driving your nails or screws. Oh, and don't forget to caulk between the edges of the sides where they meet. Third, give the caulk at least 8 hours to cure before doing your pour. If you can wait overnight, even better. I use DAP Alex Fast Dry, which says it dries in 20 to 30 minutes, but in my experience, it's not dry enough to do a pour. So apparently most garage floors are sloped. I guess this is great for drainage, but annoying as hell for someone that does a lot of epoxy pours. Anyway, another tip here is to make sure that you level your mold before pouring the epoxy. Ask me how I know. I've heard from a lot of people that still insist on using Tyvek tape. It seems some folks have had bad experiences using mold release. I think the main issue here is the application method. Spray it on somewhat heavily and use a brush to work it into the mold. After about 5 minutes, go back and just put a light mist on top. If you do it this way, I promise you will never go back. I had a few partial containers of epoxy left over from previous jobs, so I did this in 3 pours in order to use them up. First up was tabletop epoxy to help prevent leaks. Next, I used the deep pour formulation, and finally I topped it off with another layer of tabletop epoxy. By the way, if you think the tips and tricks I share in my videos are valuable, or if you just enjoy watching these builds come together, I'd like to ask for your subscription. It's the best way to support the channel, and it makes it a lot easier to justify the extra time and effort that goes into producing these videos. So if you want to see more from me, please give this video a like and subscribe. And if you're feeling extra generous with your time, leave a comment. Thanks so much for your help. Now, let's end the debate between Tyvek tape and mold release. I mean, come on, it doesn't get any better than that. Since these were a few inches wider than my planer, I took them over to my friends at Urban Industrial Design to have them surfaced. A few passes through their dual wide belt sander was all they needed before I could take them back to the shop and start cutting the miters. I was anxious to see how the edges lined up after surfacing. Not gonna lie, this was a really satisfying moment. There are 2 important things to remember when doing mitered edges like this. First, make sure your cut line is at a perfect 90 from the front edge. I used a TSO guide rail square for this. Second, and this is super important, use consistent, even pressure throughout the cut. Even minute changes in the applied pressure can create visible gaps when attempting to close the miter. I made 4 cuts total, 1 on each end of the tabletop and 1 on each leg. Three dominoes would help align and reinforce each mitered joint. But since we have 2 very different materials across the length of the miter, I needed to use multiple bonding agents. Wood glue doesn't adhere well to epoxy, so I couldn't just use that. Theoretically, I could use epoxy on the whole thing, but in my experience it tends to leave a more visible joint line when used on wood. So I used a clear tabletop epoxy for the black half and Titebond 2 dark for the walnut half, and let it sit in clamps over the weekend. Now it was time to fill in any small knots in the wood or voids left over from microbubbles in the epoxy. By the way, these little needles are awesome for this task. I think they're like sewing needles or something. Anyway, they're super inexpensive for a pack of 5 or so. If you're interested, I'll leave an affiliate link for these and other tools and supplies in the description. The sanding schedule was 120, 180, and 240. After removing the dust with a microfiber cloth, followed by some mineral spirits, I put on the finish. For this, I used my favorite 2-component hard wax oil, Natura One Coat. I did follow this up with a few coats of N3 ceramic coating for some added sheen and protection. Ben is the best kind of client. He had some good ideas and a general direction for the piece, but gave me some creative license to take it where I wanted. It was really a pleasure to build this for him, his wife, and their growing family, and it brings some additional functionality to their living space. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and again, please subscribe for more content just like this. I'll see you on the next one.